Okay, we are live. I'm very delighted to be joined today by a writer whose work I enjoy so much. Lindsay Tremuta is a Paris-based travel writer, cultural writer, essayist, explorer, and has a really beautiful, moving, provocative new essay about the idea of leaving America. And it raises this question, which I've been interested in for a long time. I just sent Lindsay this piece I think I wrote in 2011, raising some of these questions in a different season of American discontent. Uh, and the question is, America's always been a nation of immigrants, or not always, but certainly for a long time, and we think about it that way, which is to say, people who come in. Um, could America ever become a nation of immigrants? Are we even seeing right now under this Trump administration, which certainly seems to make it harder to make life work for lots of people here? Are we seeing not a huge, exodus, but are we seeing early indicators of the United States becoming, in addition to a nation of immigrants, a nation of emigrants, a country that actually sends people elsewhere in search of greener pastures? Lindsay, it is so good to see you. Thank
You
you. Your first
too.
ever Substack Live. Thanks for joining us. You
Oh,
are, of
I'm
course, the
thrilled.
author of The New Paris, a great book, The New Parisienne, which is a really special book that my wife Priya and I love so much. And I think most recently, The Eater Guide to Paris. So if you
Yeah.
actually want to know the very basic thing of where to eat in Paris, Lindsay is your guide. But she's written this really, really powerful reflection on a nation of immigrants. So tell us, is America right now in this moment becoming a nation of immigrants?
I mean, I think what's so amazing is reading your essay from 2011 just before coming on here and realizing, first of all, how did I not stumble upon it when I was writing my essay? But that we are once again in a period of this sort of thinking and that it's always really existed. It's that we sort of rediscover every time there is upheaval, turmoil, that there are greater reasons to leave, perhaps. But it is not new, and you can trace this back to the very founding of the United States. And people have always left. They've left their homes to move domestically, and then much later they started exploring elsewhere. And you actually quote in that article Isabel Wilkerson, who talked about how people, not just Americans, but people have always left in search of something else. So whether that's opportunity, whether that's fleeing persecution, and we are simply a country that for so long has told itself it was the greatest and had everything to offer its people and foreigners for that matter. So that once that stops being true, or people kind of wisen up to the reality on the ground, it becomes something they can actually entertain. They can consider leaving in the hopes of finding something else, and that sometimes does not necessarily mean that it is because they are suffering at home. But there are a plethora of reasons that one could want to leave, even if only for a time. And I think that we are now in the moment where we have to consider that as a serious topic, and what it reflects on the country as a whole. If people are really taking steps and making it a reality.
I want to read something you write here because, and just to put, I think, this in context and level set where we are. To be clear, like neither you nor I nor anybody else is suggesting that America is like emptying out as people go search elsewhere. Like I think there are places you can go. You and I have been to. You can go to go to Fujian province in China. Like a meaningful percentage of people left, such that you can feel it, right?
Mhm.
Like every household, I imagine, might have someone or know some, who. And there are places in India and the where it might be the same thing. We're not talking about that,
No.
right? But you are picking up on real, maybe early indicators of, as you say, a wave in this moment driven by, what we would call, if it was another country, human rights violations,
Yeah.
like, the deprivation of reproductive rights, for example. But also just the thing that drives so many people to other countries, which is the difficulty of making a life. And
Yeah.
as you say, America's a big country where traditionally, when it wasn't working for you someplace, you go to some other place, right? The Great Migration is
Exactly.
this historic departure of African Americans from the South to the North, precisely because of human rights violations and also economic opportunity and other things. But what you're describing in this passage I want to read is maybe an incipient trend of finding those greener pastures internationally instead of domestically. So you write, a recent Gallup poll found that 40% of women aged 15 to 44 would leave the US if they could. 40% of women, a figure that has quadrupled in the last decade. This slice of the population also has the lowest confidence in American institutions. That frustration is inspiring many to take action. Ireland's Central Statistics Office reported a 96% jump in American emigration between April 2024 and 2025. France has likewise reported an increase in long-stay visa requests from Americans. And in the United Kingdom, 6,618 U.S. citizens applied for British citizenship in the 12 months leading up to March 2025, the highest number since record-keeping began 21 years earlier.
Mm.
Germany, which allows descendants of Nazi-era victims to apply for and reclaim citizenship, processed 48% more applications from U.S. citizens at consulates across the U.S. in 2025 after Trump's inauguration than in 2024. Just to underline that, people are applying to become citizens of Germany
Yeah.
under a program designed to allow people who lost citizenship under the Nazis to
Yep.
become German again being like an 80-year gap.
I know several people actually who fit that exact category as well,
Talk
and have
about
done
them and
so
talk about
even
this
before.
larger trend you're seeing.
Well, so, what's interesting about that is that, I think many people who have, been eligible for that sort of visa, or double citizenship, particularly with Germany, have done so in many years past as an opportunity, okay? So, a lot of what we're seeing, it's very hard to dig into the differences between people who are applying for double nationality because they're already eligible, they have heritage, and those who are simply looking to get out and hope that they will eventually end up on a track that allows them to pursue permanent residency or citizenship. But even among my friend group, I know at least 2 out of 5 people who have German citizenship for the very reason discussed in that passage you read. Um,
Like their families were they're not just
yes,
like German, their families were victims of the Nazis
yes,
2
yes, direct.
generations ago.
Yeah, and I
Are they
remember
Jewish?
reading. Yes, they're Jewish. Yeah,
So they're
exactly.
American Jews applying to become German
Mhm,
out of concern
absolutely.
about Donald Trump.
Yeah. And the reality is that it might seem completely, shocking and wild to think that people who fled wartime in Europe, Jewish or not, are now seeking citizenship in the very countries their families once fled. I think are a testament to the real moment of concern and dissatisfaction that we're facing. And these are people who perhaps just want the option, but also know that things have changed in those European nations, and the fundamentals of society might be so much more favorable that they would imagine moving their entire lives, even if they've spent 50, 60 years in the United States. So I think these moments do inspire people to think of something they've never thought of before. Um, but again, this isn't totally new either. It's just that when you read that passage, it certainly highlights that we're in a moment of increased concern and curiosity and investigation. But as you said in the beginning, people are not fleeing. America doesn't feel empty either. And the other thing to think about is that there have always been both military and people who have chosen to live abroad or have always lived abroad. Something around 5 to 6 million Americans at any given time living abroad, and those numbers are a bit imprecise because they don't. The U.S. government doesn't fully track it the way they could. But we're not an insignificant cohort living abroad. And so when it comes to trying to stay on top of our civic duty, though we're living abroad and that sort of thing, the US also makes that quite challenging for us.
I mean, it's on the order of 5 million. It's on the order of magnitude of the population of an average American state, right? So you can
Yeah.
almost think about it as a 51st state of an
Absolutely.
American diaspora. There's one thing you talk about in the piece that's very important, which is that, when you think about immigration to the United States, um, often by virtue of who chooses to leave, it's people coming from often poor countries, obviously not always, and it's often people within those countries who were less well off than other people. If you were rolling in dough in India or Nigeria or China, like maybe you don't feel driven to leave. Um, but emigration out of the United States doesn't quite follow that logic. Maybe it can't. Can you talk about who is actually leaving and the privilege of leaving? And are you seeing less privileged people leave, or is that basically impossible?
I don't think it's impossible. Surely the bulk of people we're talking about are people who have some form of means. So whether that's simply they can easily or accessibly obtain a passport if they don't have one. And we know in America that's becoming harder and harder for people who are living either in rural areas or are in parts of disenfranchised regions in America where they don't have similarly with the voter ID or the real ID that became a requirement in the US, that was a real uh, s- move of disenfranchisement for a lot of people because they simply don't have access. So of course access is one piece. The means to certainly go through the paperwork and the bureaucracy, there is a cost. It's a cost that is not as that dissimilar to what it costs foreigners trying to enter America either, and stay long term. So I think there is a sort of comparable upfront cost that people need to consider, but perhaps they could save to meet. And then there's the idea of how do you navigate on the ground, and so either that means you speak another language, you have the ability to learn, or people on the ground. So while I don't have any hard data to suggest that there are people who are, extremely underprivileged who end up here, I do know plenty of people who didn't come over with much money. They had emptied their bank accounts. Maybe they had $1,000 to $10,000 in savings max. And they rebuilt here. And that's in France, which is not at all the, cheapest country to settle in.
A lot of
Um,
people also went to Portugal, I heard.
Portugal's a big one, and Portugal has really changed their policies in recent years, after having sort of let people in under the very privileged route of the golden visa, which had to do with a certain amount of money and a certain profile. Now they're sort of backtracking on that. And this is the danger also of this scenario, is that you let a lot of people in who have a potentially higher income bracket. Americans, even if they don't come over with a lot, but they're working, let's say, remotely for an American company or a foreign company, they probably have a spend that's higher than the local population. So this creates this imbalance. I don't think we've seen that yet in Paris. Paris is obviously a relatively expensive city, and that is a much different scenario than what's happening in Lisbon and other European nations, Barcelona being another one. But it's just to say that there is a certain amount of privilege. However, you do not need to be flush to make this sort of a change. And so I think that's one thing that I see gut reactions all the time online with these articles coming out about Americans choosing to leave, and I think the gut reaction is to say, well, it must be nice to be able to do that because only a certain privileged group can do that, and I think that's true only to a point.
Um, in the 2011 piece I sent you, the one of the kind of images that came to me is the way we have Chinatowns. We talk about Chinatowns. I live in New York City where there's many Chinatowns.
Yeah.
Um, will we ever have America towns one day? Right?
Well,
Could you imagine being in Shanghai or Mumbai or Lagos and there being an area that's America Town, and it's got some American expat businesses, and the language is all English, catchphrases or slogans or whatever. Um, is that something you could picture?
not in any immediate future. Certainly in big capitals, we do see pockets of American communities forming and, running businesses, but that doesn't mean that they're isolated in the way that you were describing it in that piece. And But, one day could that happen? I think some certain things do need to happen for there to be this sort of massive movement. But look at what it takes to get people, I think, to participate in grassroots movements, even within the United States. I think it's quite challenging, and so the idea that people would en masse leave and develop their own little American towns elsewhere, I think isn't super likely. But I think it's a very fascinating image, and one that I think is worth putting out there for people to really consider.
Um, I'm gonna read this, comment from the chat, which I think is provocative but also
Mhm.
relevant from Silas Do Good. So what you were saying is that people who have the money and resources to stay in the country and help campaigns to change its politics are leaving, while those who don't have the means to contribute to those changes are left to fend for themselves. And you deal with this very head on in the piece. How do
Yeah.
you deal with this notion of if you're so anguished about these things and you have privileges and means, you should stay and fight?
It is a valid emotional reaction. Um, and I think that there are a lot of people who do feel that way. And I think there are also very educated and resource filled individuals who are staying for that reason, even though they could leave. I think it, however, doesn't consider the fact that we can be very engaged from where we live, even if it isn't within the United States. Um, can we form groups that push people to vote, that push people to call their representatives to demonstrate here where we can? Yes, we can do that. I have been part of several events in the beginning of this year, even. Um, to prove to people in this community that they aren't alone, that they can be involved, they aren't helpless. And so I think while it can feel very hurtful for people who are struggling within the U.S. with what is happening, that they feel that there is, the people who choose to leave are completely um, severing their ties with the U.S. or are doing so without the intention of still trying to support the people doing the work on the ground. And I think, yes, that it can feel that way. But what I'm seeing are plenty of people, especially in big cities in Europe, who are super engaged and feel just as distraught. Our means of getting involved are different, but not insignificant.
I also think there's something, you know, ahistorical about the idea that your physical presence determines your civic action. I mean, there were plenty of in James Baldwin's era, there were plenty of writers who didn't flee like him and stayed here domestically that didn't engage in issues or didn't change the conversation or didn't, they were here, they were
Mhm.
around, they had an American zip code. Uh, he went to France and probably had more impact on the American conversation and his own awakening of seeing America clearly because his physical body happened to be in a different place. There's plenty of people who are here but don't do the things they should. I also think when you think about creative work, you think about, like calling your congressman is not the only way to make a society
Oh,
different or better. There is so much artistic work to be done right now. I mean, I
yeah.
think of all the deficits we have, the artistic burden of rendering this moment, of making us legible to each other, of explaining the deeper undercurrents of what is going on. Um, and sometimes people need to go to different places to do that work. Sometimes people need to there's a lot of complexity that I think we should allow for here. And we got 350 million people here, a lot of whom are physically resident but don't even vote. So the association of kind of physical residence with civic participation is not always clear to me.
I agree. I think we don't allow enough of that nuance. And certainly, I'm seeing some pretty astounding creative work come out of people living outside of the US right now who are American or are very touched by um, the situation in the US, largely because they are outside of the country. Um, Obviously, you have such a curious and tapped in group of followers at the Ink who know, I'm sure, that we're about to have a presidential election in France next year. My role also as an American living here is to alert and be talking very vocally about the US to voters here who don't see the writing on the wall, who don't see perhaps that we're at risk of the very same things happening, billionaire takeovers, censorship, um, uh, interference in the digital conversation. All of these things have the potential to develop here. And so it's almost as though the more I'm engaged in commenting and discussing with people the American situation, it's also a way of saying, what happens in America affects the rest of the world, and this is the time to be speaking up. Given the election cycles going on here as well, everything is
I mean, I wanted
connected.
to ask you about
Yeah.
there's a little bit of a whack-a-mole aspect of it also, which you're getting at. I mean, I was talking to some folks in the UK last year about Americans who are going. A lot of it is there's a lot of this exploration among writers and professors and other people who are afraid of being persecuted by Donald Trump.
Mhm.
Um, and I mean, I don't think we would say to German scholars 80 years ago, like, why didn't you stay and fight, right? So people are looking abroad, and a lot of these immigration lawyers and others will say, hey, be careful. The most anti-immigrant forces in the UK are currently polling
Yeah.
in the lead. You might move your family over here and try to protect yourself, and then you're living with, Trump with a British accent a couple of years from now. Or you may move to France and you may be living with, the next generation of far-right movement in France commanding
Absolutely.
the government. So, is this a game you can win?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that's what's important to remember. The sentiment around, I think, leaving has changed so rapidly basically since the first Trump election. There were rumblings of a desire to leave should he get elected. Most of it was, not a bluff, but people didn't really act on that feeling. Um, and the thinking then was, well, there are still greener pastures elsewhere. But the reality is things change very quickly. Um, if we look at the political system in Hungary, which, yes, did finally, after all these years, reelect someone else who is frankly conservative. Do we think that's going to be the silver bullet for the country that, I think people in the West are hoping? We don't know. But does that mean that the situation is going to radically improve for citizens and anybody who's looking to move over there? No. Italy, still with a far right head of state. France, we are constantly teetering on the edge of a far right takeover. The reality is there are certain values that may not be up for negotiation. Will every single social foundation that we have here today, in France, for example, be eliminated should Marine Le Pen or her young successor take over? Maybe not. When it comes to healthcare, I don't think that that is even a debate on the far right, in the way that it would be, for example, in the US. So it may not look identical to the massive shift that we've seen in the US, but that doesn't mean it won't make life very difficult for certain people. We have already seen, to give you a very concrete example, um, one of the former ministers in Macron's government, before he left, Bruno Retailleau, made the language requirements for permanent residency and for citizenship much more challenging. And should the far right get in, we know they will probably take that even further. So trying to control who actually is allowed to stay in the country, who deserves to be French, who deserves to be part of this society, all of that will be questioned even further. So I think people are looking for certain aspects of life that will be improved, even if they can't check every single box. Um, I don't think there is a utopia. I think we want there to be, and maybe there was a moment where everything seemed on the whole better in, I don't know, somewhere in Scandinavia or in New Zealand. But the thing is these movements are global and they overlap, and they might not feel the same at the very same moment, but you're always at the risk of sort of leaving one problem for another. So that needs to be part of your decision making if you're going to leave. And I think some people cast that aside. And other people are fully cognizant that they're walking into a situation where they might have to make very different or very similar decisions for themselves down the road.
Couple things before I let you go. One is, if you think about the idea of asylum, um, historically, it's a deeply important moral principle, legal principle, principle of international law, and it is this notion of, the obligation, the duty to provide refuge to people who are fleeing persecution and, and other kind of terrors. Obviously, Trump and people like him around the world trying to clamp down on that. Um, but the granting of asylum is also can be political, right? So
Mhm.
in moments when the United States has wanted to make a statement about Cuba, then there's, you know, effort made to make those asylum claims and to really center that. And then, right now, Trump is doing it with white South Africans who are apparently, really in bad shape in South Africa, and so he's granting asylum to them. Here's a question for you: do you think it would be a like genuinely a good idea, or b smart, cunning politics for certain countries in Europe or elsewhere to grant asylum to Americans for certain things? Should France, where you live, grant asylum to any woman from Texas who can't access reproductive freedom where she is? Obviously, you can go to other states, but would it be, that's difficult for a lot of people? Should France, I don't know, it might make quite a statement to fly an Airbus to Texas, pick up a bunch of women who need reproductive care and fly them to France um, for the kind of care they can't get in their state. Of course, these kinds of things are deterred by the power of the United States. When you have aircraft carriers, people don't mess with you in this way. Do you think there's a place for European countries that have a real meaningful difference with the U.S. philosophically right now to actually, whether genuinely or somewhat performatively, grant Americans asylum?
I mean, wouldn't that be nice even just to see them try? We know how quickly opposition from Macron and the other European leaders, faced with discussions with Trump on Iran and other issues, how quickly he becomes hostile and threatens them with, a litany of different repercussions. I would love to see them try. I don't think, unfortunately, I don't think that France has the courage to do that. I think the only leader I see right now who could potentially do that is the president or the prime minister of Spain, who has been very vocal and far more um, assertive in highlighting how much he differs philosophically from even his European counterparts. I could think of healthcare being one critical reason to get to do a move like that, in addition to women's reproductive rights. The number of people who can't get care is astounding. I mean, I, for one, know that I would be in a much different place if I didn't have access to, my neurological care here. Again, I didn't leave for that reason, but this is something that is some I consider very strongly when I think about my life and my future. But then again, that would raise a lot of domestic issues here. As soon as Macron attributed citizenship to George Clooney, for example, everyone was outraged because of how streamlined and simple the process was. He obviously spends a lot of money in this country. But you see, if you were to start to bring over Americans in a big wave, those who desperately need a certain type of care, I could very well see the French population rising up and saying, well, you're doing more for them than you do for us. That is a potential, certainly in any of these nations, but one that I feel particularly plausible in France. But I think it's a strong idea and would make a statement, and one that would get people talking, and that's the point.
Hopefully Macron is an Inca follower. Last thing, I some people may know this, some may not. I lived in France when I was a child, from 7 to
Mm.
10 years old, and it really altered my whole life. I think I'm a journalist because of that. I mean, as young as I was, I think I'm a journalist because of that time. I think I have an outside-in view of my own country, the United States, because of that time. It's
Yeah.
such a profoundly life-altering experience to be able to do that and have the privilege of doing that, which I did as a child. Um, and then I spent most of my 20s in India, in some ways inspired by what I experienced as a child. And one of the things that I've experienced in those periods abroad is um, your imagination about what your country could be can really grow in that environment. And I'm curious for you, living in a place where healthcare is an inalienable right,
Mm.
um, living in a place that has, just a different concept of what we owe each other. Not saying it's flawless. There's many things I think that are actually much worse in France. France is not a place I would want to be a creator of a new thing. Like, I would not want to build a Substack in France necessarily. Like, there's a lot of things where it's not the best place in the world for at all. Um, but I wonder how living there as an American who's feels a lot of loyalty to America, how has it enlarged or altered your imagination about what America could be?
I think it shows a sense of humanity that I haven't felt, um, Americans offered each other in a long, long time. I think there's a sense of community that we've seen in certain very local communities coming out of, the US since the beginning of the year, Minneapolis, among others. Those moments show me something that I have felt and seen in France for the last 20 years. And so I guess what I realize, especially when I meet so many Americans either living in Europe or passing through Europe, is how smart and motivated and thoughtful and creative they are and can be. And I just want the best of these nations over here that we could learn from. I mean, I think that's really what living abroad is about too, is realizing that if we could take a little bit from here and take a little bit from there and realize that that doesn't make us lesser than because we're borrowing, and adopting from other cultures. I mean, I see that as being a way that America could be what it told itself it was. Um, but there are certain things that really need to happen, and I guess I just until certain conversations are, non-negotiable among political, contenders, I don't know that we'll get there. Um, but I really want them to, and I think, we like to think of France as having, as you described, so many amazing benefits. Entrepreneurship is not the the easiest, but when it comes to these social, seemingly unalienable rights, they were fought for, and I think we need to allow for that kind of resistance movement that we've seen happen in France and other countries in Europe to be able to happen without some threat of censorship or, I don't know, martial law or any of the other realities that I think stop people, at least from our perspective over here, that seem to be stopping Americans from demanding and fighting for the very things that they deserve, especially as a seemingly wealthy and powerful country. So that's what I wish. I wish everyone could have, at least 6 months to a year to live abroad and have the experience that you and I have had, at different points in our lives, because it is so clarifying. And for those for whom it's not clarifying and they just sort of double down on the great American experience, then that's they can stay over there. But I think where we'd be so much better globally as a as a people if we could learn from each other. And I'm grateful that I can see these perspectives over here and try to share that with people that I communicate with every day who are still living in the US.
Um, well, it's a really powerful essay you have. It's in the Bitter Southerner. It's called "Leaving America," and it was in the link that I sent out, and it'll be in this video when I send that out later today. Lindsay Tramuta, always so great to
And
talk
also
with you.
so good to see you. Come
I
back.
wish you lived here in America so we could like get coffee, but it's great to chat with you, and thank you for such a thoughtful, provocative piece.
Thank you for having me. Come back soon.